In this video, we're going to assess the most important question at the heart of this channel: why is Lucy Letby innocent? In order to do this, we're going to examine 10 different sections associated with the case, going over all of the most important elements. In this part 1, Lucy's background. One of the things that we know about Lucy is that she wanted to be a nurse from a very early age. This was apparently because she herself had a traumatic early existence, and she was very grateful towards a nurse who essentially saved her life. So her friend Dawn Howe, who's pictured on the screen here, made it very clear when she was interviewed by the BBC that Lucy had always wanted to work as a nurse and had never considered any other career. So this wasn't something she went into lightly, and she can't possibly, at that very early age, have decided, right, well, I want to become a nurse so that I can murder babies in the future. This was a vocation for Lucy. It was something she was extremely passionate about. This is something that we see throughout Lucy's training, where she was very highly regarded, and then when she went onto the actual neonatal unit, she was a very highly regarded nurse. Now, there are a few comments that have been made about her training that have been publicised in the press that were made during the Thurwell inquiry. I happen to know that those are very poorly founded, and there's going to be further information about that in my book. I can't discuss that at this point in time, but all of the evidence points to the fact that Lucy was a highly regarded nurse. You see on the screen now that this is Karen Rees, who described as the creme de la creme, and quite simply, if you're not at that level, you don't become a neonatal nurse. You have to be one of the best. Only approximately 5% will make it through. So Lucy did stand out, and then once she gained more confidence in herself, she really stood out as she began to work on the unit. Another big red flag, which would indicate that Lucy is in no way someone that you would suspect of murder, is that her character and personality is not consistent with this. So I've written down a few of the issues here that point to Lucy being literally as far away as possible from being a murderer in terms of personality and character as you could possibly imagine. So the first thing is there's no evidence of macabre or dark interests. In fact, everything points to strong evidence of femininity. So if we look at her house, for example, it was always decorated in a way that you would typically associate with a female. She had a nursery that she hadn't even begun to redecorate, and she probably wouldn't have done, because she always expressed very clearly from a very early age that she wanted to have a family, and that was a priority for her. The next thing on the list is there's no criminogenic factors. So this refers to factors that could point to a possibility of someone being a criminal. So she wasn't antisocial, there's no indication of lack of empathy, quite the opposite. She didn't engage in substance or alcohol abuse. There's no lack of ambition or discipline, no vocational problems. There's no history of violence. There's no mental health issues. Sometimes self-harm can be associated with a high risk of criminality. There's no dysfunctional family history. In fact, she was very, very close to her parents. The next thing is she had a love of animals. She had indeed adopted rescue cats. You can see Lucy here with 2 cats. These, in fact, are not her rescue cats, which are on the screen now. This is Tigger and Smudge. These were rescue cats. So she, broadly speaking, had a love of animals, which is, again, not something that you would associate with someone that had issues related to criminogenic factors. If we go back to the list again, she was very sociable with a strong friendship group. She had a very close relationship with her parents. She never made any reference to murders or deaths related to the unit anywhere, except for saying that she felt very sorry for the parents of twins that died on the unit because she had a particularly good relationship with them. And equally, not only did she have this good character, this very stable character, but there's no evidence of any deterioration in her mental state or her character. Usually as people begin killing and then become a serial killer, they disintegrate and descend into an ever more troubled state of mind. And that just simply didn't happen in Lucy Letby. We know that from the way she was in the unit, and we know that from what was recovered from her house. There's simply no indication that she had deteriorated in any way. And then the last thing that we should mention as well is that there's no motive. So she didn't give any indication of any pleasure or pride in any supposed killings, as is common with serial killers. In fact, she never referenced them at all, not least because they didn't happen. But she clearly had no motive, and indeed the prosecution didn't even suggest a motive for these supposed murders, because Lucy doesn't benefit from them in any way, quite clearly, and she didn't demonstrate any behavioural differences, either negative in terms of her dissent or positive from her perspective in terms of noting these murders. So there is no reason for Lucy to want to harm infants. It's not consistent with anything that we know about her. Everything about her character, her personality, what we know about her as a nurse points to innocence. Part 2. The hospital. We know for a fact that Lucy was targeted because of a commonality with deaths on the unit. This is not surprising because she did a lot of shifts as a highly regarded member of staff, and the unit, as we know, was staffed by a lot of part-time and bank staff. So the fact that Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam, very early on in the events of the Count of Chester, felt, particularly Stephen Breary, I should say that Stephen Breary was the ringleader. He managed to get Dr. Ravi Jairam on side, but we should remember that it was Dr. Stephen Breary that was unquestionably the originator of this theory. At the initial time when this occurred, which you can see on the screen now, the 22nd of June 2015, there was literally only a small commonality with a small number of infants. There was no reason to suspect Lucy whatsoever. We also know that this was a failing hospital. This has been extremely well documented. The sepsis that was virtually endemic on the unit, the Pseudomonas that was a dangerous bacteria that was known to be circulating, and it's not as if that this wasn't known by the paediatricians and by the other members of staff on the unit. They were very much aware of it, but it was just something that was seemingly swept under the carpet. As the expert panel that are working in Lucy's defence now have uncovered more problems, there have been further infections. One of the most infamous issues as well is that there was sewage that was running through the unit, and they didn't deal with any of these things adequately, and consequently this was a failing hospital with extremely poor sanitary conditions. They're dealing with vulnerable infants. There can be major problems very easily. We also know that there were a lot of medical errors on the unit. There's a list of 11 here that were discovered by the expert panel. That's only 11 of the 25 that they cited, plus they cited a lot of individual errors as well. So we know that a lot of mistakes were made by essentially staff that were underskilled, undertrained, and that had a dearth of experience. And they were dealing with a level of acuity in the infants that they'd never dealt with before. And it's therefore not terribly surprising that they encountered difficulties. Indeed, we know that issues at the hospital were instrumental in the collapse and deaths of several infants on the unit. Over the 12 months that ultimately ended up being in the indictment when Lucy Letby went to court, Stephen Breary maintained a campaign that I've already mentioned and ran this against Lucy Letby. I've gone over this in my 3 timeline videos that you can see on this channel. Lucy eventually took out a grievance procedure against the consultants on the unit, and every single point of her grievance procedure was upheld. In usual circumstances, this would be seen as a case of bullying where some consultants essentially harassed a young nurse who was working on the unit pretty much straight out of university. And indeed, after a grievance procedure was upheld, the consultants kept pushing despite knowing about the problems on the unit, and there is a email from a lawyer at this time, Ian Pace, indicating that Lucy would be extremely likely, basically inevitably, would be granted constructive dismissal, and that indeed this was the best possible outcome for the hospital. Because if this didn't happen, if Lucy wasn't just granted constructive dismissal and things were allowed to disappear quietly, then the hospital faced the prospect of action from parents, and this could have been very financially damaging for the Count of Chester. We've only recently, in the last few days, seen this story about the NHS facing £60 billion of negligence claims, an extraordinary figure, but that is literally the scale and scope of problems that exist in the healthcare system, and the Countess of Chester was simply one example of this, perhaps a particularly bad example, but not that far out of the ordinary. The only difference is they blamed everything on Lucy. They targeted Lucy, and now Lucy is in prison because of the failings of this hospital. Indeed, eventually the police were called and the police investigation began. In this part 3, the police investigation. So, contrary to the impression that many people have and that has been communicated through the media generally, the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester was not blinking red, far from it, and the consultants didn't have some incredible folder full of evidence on Lucy Letby. When the case was passed to Cheshire Police on the 2nd of May 2017, there was no evidence presented whatsoever, as you can see in this document here from the Cheshire Constabulary, which states there is no evidence other than coincidence. Having spoken to Stephanie Davis, who was employed by the Cheshire Constabulary at the time and worked closely with the police on this investigation, she filed her review on this case on the 8th of May, just 6 days after it was initiated, by a letter being sent from the Countess of Chester Hospital to the Cheshire Constabulary. And Stephanie indicated that there was no evidence of malfeasance, but there were some missing jigsaw pieces. On the 12th of May, the Cheshire Constabulary had a meeting with 3 executives from the Countess of Chester, and they concluded that all possible lines of investigation had been excluded, and there was nothing that could possibly lead to a criminal investigation. Exactly because of what was stated on the 2nd of May, there was no evidence. There were several other statements in this particular meeting. I've been over them in several videos, including the timeline video that I mentioned. But on the 12th of May 2017, the Cheshire Constabulary quite clearly had no intention of investigating. Then on the 15th of May, just 3 days later, a meeting took place between Cheshire Constabulary, Dr. Ravi Jairam and Dr. Stephen Breary, the aforementioned consultants who ran a campaign against Lucy Letby on the unit. Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam proceeded to seed the police with information of varying degrees of accuracy, most of it inaccurate. And then the police suddenly decided to investigate. Indeed, by the 18th of May 2017, they'd already told the Guardian newspaper that they were definitely going to run an investigation. So this is a very extraordinary timeline in which just 6 days after believing that there was absolutely no evidence, and to be fair, they still would have believed that on the 14th of May, and even at the start of the 15th of May before they met Breary and Jairam. So within just 3 days, they went from having no indication, no intention of investigating whatsoever, to not only deciding that they would investigate, but releasing this information to the media. I would say that that was highly premature, regardless of what you know about the police investigation, which I have discussed in the most recent video that I made, in which Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham interview Paul Hughes, but I will be making more videos on that in the foreseeable future. There is overwhelming evidence of confirmation bias running all the way through the police investigation. It's very clear that the police were way out of their depth in attempting to run a medical investigation. When Dr. Ravi Jairam arrives in the police station, he states that there needs to be a multidisciplinary review. It's very clear that Cheshire Police didn't have the slightest idea how to do this, and they very quickly zoned in on Lucy Letby and then made her pretty much the sole focus of the investigation. Then they involved Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam in the investigation, both in the selection of cases, and Dr. Breary it was who identified the insulin cases that would prove central to the entire indictment against Lucy Letby. Overall, what you're looking at here is an incompetent police investigation that was riddled with confirmation bias and which focused on Lucy Letby as the exclusive cause of issues on the unit, when in fact what we're looking at was a nuanced clinical picture involving many different factors. It was just impossible, seemingly, for Cheshire Police to understand this. In this video, part 4, the so-called experts. The lead prosecution witness in the court case is Dr. Dewi Evans, who is pictured on the screen now. One of the notable things about Dr. Evans is that he inserted himself into the case by writing to the National Crime Agency, having supposedly seen a newspaper report regarding the case and reflecting that it sounded like his sort of case. He then drove from his home in Carmarthen to Blacon Police Station in Chester on approximately the 10th of July 2017, walked straight into the police station and immediately stated that inflicted harm was involved in the case. This is now considered to be utterly extraordinary, considering that many neonatal experts who far outrank Dr. Evans have assessed all of the case notes and couldn't find any evidence of malfeasance. It should also be noted that Dr. Evans was long since retired at this point. He wasn't and never has been a neonatologist, and he wasn't even licensed to practice when he testified as an expert in the case. There was also controversy regarding Dr. Evans because another judge, Lord Justice Jackson, had described work and evidence that he provided in a previous case as worthless, citing extreme levels of bias. Now, this is extremely inappropriate for an expert witness who is supposed to give an impartial opinion. And Lord Justice Jackson wrote to Judge James Goss, the judge in the Lucy Letby case, indicating that his evidence was worthless, and frankly, Judge Goss should have thrown Dr. Evans out of the case immediately. The only reason, in my opinion, that he didn't do this is that he knew the case would collapse and the criminal justice system would look utterly ridiculous. Since the court case concluded, Dr. Evans has made numerous media appearances during which he has made a litany of extraordinary comments. You have one on the screen here in which he tells the British Medical Journal that he has not heard any criticism from any individual whose view that he respects, or any criticism from an organisation whose view that he respects. Incredible considering the calibre of people that are now in the defence for Lucy Letby. Indeed, Dr. Evans has contradicted himself so many times by now that he has become a figure of ridicule, essentially, in this case. In this video, it's also important to emphasise that Dr. Evans often attempts to defend himself by stating that there were 6 other expert witnesses, but in reality they played a very minimal role in this case. Indeed, 2 of them didn't appear in court at all. The peer review of Dr. Sandy Bohin was extremely poor, based on Dr. Evans passing his notes and conclusions over to her and she deciding that she agreed with all of them, essentially. Other experts did not feature prominently in court, and we also know that the police arrested Lucy Letby for the first time based on the evidence of Dr. Evans, and then Dr. Evans also filed new reports from multiple infants in the case after he knew that Lucy Letby was a suspect. The case of Child C has been particularly contentious, with Dr. Evans changing his diagnosis during the court case and after the court case. He has claimed previously that he didn't do this, but then when he spoke to the BBC, he then claimed that it doesn't matter that he changed his opinion. He has since, following a Channel 4 documentary, written a letter on this topic as well, which makes some other extraordinary claims. At the time of recording this video, the full story of this has yet to be told. Part 5, Medical Evidence. The central contention in the Lucy Letby case is that Lucy Letby destabilised infants by injecting air into them or via a nasogastric tube. This is covered in the video that you can see on the screen now, Lucy Letby and the impossible air injection theory. There are so many problems with this that I can't possibly go over them in this video, but one of the main ones is that Dr. Evans used a paper that was authored by Lee and Tanswell that goes by the title of Pulmonary Vascular Air Embolism in the Newborn. Again, I can't go over all of the problems with using this as the sole diagnostic source. One of the most obvious ones is it doesn't describe the right type of air embolism. But Dr. Lee, Professor Lee I should say, is now centrally involved in the defence of Lucy Letby and has pointed out that this paper is completely misused and that the so-called diagnoses, which are never diagnoses because of Dr. Evans' extremely poor practice, but that the so-called diagnoses in this court case are just completely erroneous. And this is broadly accepted now because so many experts have looked at the cases and they all treat it with complete derision. In this video, we're going. Another theory that Dr. Evans floated in court was the idea that Lucy Letby had deliberately poisoned infants with milk. Again, this has been treated with utter derision by neonatal experts, and frankly, the cross-examination of both Dr. Dewi Evans and Dr. Sandy Bohin in court in relation to this allegation was surreal to the point of being embarrassing. Other allegations were made regarding Child E and Child O, and Lucy Letby damaging them with tools that were hypothetically available on the unit that are very poorly founded and that have been strongly opposed by far more qualified people than Dr. Evans. The last thing that is important to note with regard to the medical evidence is that children that were involved in the indictment were much more unwell than was presented in court. Typically, the notion presented by the prosecution and Dr. Evans was that a child was doing well and was basically reasonably well, and then the infant suddenly collapsed for no apparent reason. This is absolutely farcical, again, when you look at the picture of these infants that were often chronically unwell, that were very vulnerable, that had a multitude of different conditions. This assertion that was made by Dr. Evans and that was then conveyed by the prosecution as a central part of its case is just simply untenable. Part 6. Insulin evidence. So I've made several videos on this already, and the purpose of this video is not to go into these topics in great depth. As you can see, there's already possibly 7 hours of video, and I'll be making more on the insulin cases in the future. But the first thing to note is that there was no forensic evidence in this court case because of forensic services that are associated with the court process in Britain, in common with so much else of Britain being underfunded, defunded and defunct, essentially. There were issues with the immunoassay testing that was used in court, which is essentially that it's not good enough. It's not a forensic test. There are all kinds of problems with immunoassays, and these are well known. No confirmatory testing was done. This was known to be the case. This is not what should have happened. And part of the reason for this was because the infants that were supposedly poisoned with insulin did not die, and so no one was really concerned about insulin at the time. Indeed, this is why very little testing was done, although there was a pattern of poor testing on the unit, and this was just one example. There are then, on top of that, problems with the court case, because there is no doubt that the immunoassay test that was done should then have been sent to a specialist laboratory in Guildford for a definitive test. This never happened, and yet so-called experts in court, including Dr. Gwen Walk, indicated that tests, and there's another one as well I should mention called Dr. Anna Milan, made very strange comments regarding Guildford, that was not the reason the cases were sent to Guildford, when it's known that that was the case. When it's the test that was used, there is a warning on it saying if exogenous insulin is suspected, this needs to go to Guildford. So why the court was essentially completely misinformed on this topic, and why it was misinformed, I have no idea. Another issue here is that this is entirely hypothetical. The bags from this court case, supposedly Lucy has tampered with the feeding bags of infants. The bags were never kept and never tested. This is just a hypothesis that's been pulled out of nowhere. And I'm not going to go over all of the problems with the hypothesis in this video because I want to keep this relatively succinct. But Lucy Letby would have needed ESP, extrasensory perception, to poison the bag successfully on this unit because she was not on duty for several of the incidents and several of the important events that are associated with these supposed poisonings. Another problem is that the measurement of C-peptide was used in the court case, but we know that there are issues with regard to measurements of C-peptide in neonates. I've got a academic paper on the screen now. This isn't the one that has now gone into Lucy Letby's defence. There's new research indicating that the difference between the levels of insulin and the levels of C-peptide were not unusual for neonates. They may be unusual for adults, but they're not unusual for neonates. And you can see there's a paper here, C-peptide suppression during insulin infusion in the extremely preterm infant is associated with insulin sensitivity. So the biology and the anatomy of neonates is very complex, and there is enormous doubt over the validity of these readings. Another problem with the insulin case is that Lucy was tricked in court by very underhand methods to essentially stating that she agreed with the proposition that someone was poisoned on the unit. But in actual fact, she's not qualified to give an opinion, and this was just a deceitful part of the court case. We'll be discussing that more in part 8 of this video. Finally, it's important to note that all of the problems with the insulin cases were known about already. This is not some new revelation. All of the issues with immunoassays, all of the issues that were palpable in the Lucy Letby case have already been included in previous prosecutions. Britain has essentially been making this mistake over and over and again for 20 years, and this needs to be the last time that it happens. In this video, part 7, the anecdotal evidence. So there was some extremely weak anecdotal evidence used in court, and I've already made several videos on the various elements of this. There's one element of this on the screen now. Did Lucy Letby really admit to murder in a confession note? So infamously, the prosecution presented a note that they claimed was a confession of murder. When one actually examines this note, it is absolutely farcical that this was used in court. There are a couple of phrases that were isolated and strongly emphasised by both the prosecution and the media, but it's since become very clear from a more nuanced reading of the note that there are many, many more statements indicating innocence and trauma in this note, and that it's clearly not a confession note. It's also notable that Lucy was recommended to write these notes on the instruction of Occupational Health Representative Catherine de Bager, which further discredits the notion that they were confession notes. And then on top of that, there's a blue post-it note that I've cited numerous times that has exculpatory statements that are a much stronger indication of innocence than anything across the several notes that indicates guilt. And then, of course, on top of that, there are many other statements that point to Lucy being not guilty. So overall, the confession notes are extremely weak evidence. And there's also now someone in her defence who says that this is an expert on note-taking, and this expert indicates that there is nothing in these notes to indicate that anyone should consider them to be a confession, which should, to be honest, not require an expert because it's blindingly obvious anyway. The next thing I'm going to move on to is the bane of my existence, which is the handover sheets in the case. So Lucy was accused of deliberately taking home handover sheets, which were presented in court as being medical documents, which they're not really. There's a few things to mention here. Firstly, it's very obvious that she put these in her pocket and took them home accidentally. Secondly, the suggestion in court and suggestion since is that she treasured these notes when in reality, as you can see on the screen now, a lot of them were found in a bin bag in a garage being ready to be thrown away, and many others were found in a Morrison's carrier bag that was kept under her bed. In my opinion, the most important thing, though, is that this has literally nothing to do with the indictment whatsoever. It's completely irrelevant to the indictment. It has nothing to do with the allegations, and it doesn't even come close to being what you could describe as a valid form of evidence. Speaking of non-valid forms of evidence, the Facebook searches that Lucy made were cited in court. This was utterly ridiculous because there's just no indication that there was anything malignant about this. Again, it's not related to the indictment, and there was also an enormous number of Facebook searches done that are nothing to do with the case. As you can see on the screen now, the number of searches related to the indictment were approximately 1%. And of course, that's significant in itself, but just because Lucy searched for parents from the indictment, that doesn't mean she did that maliciously. Obviously, she could have done that because she was concerned about their well-being and just happened to be looking them up, but it was not something she was obsessed with or fixated on. Look at the percentage of searches there were compared to searches for other people who had nothing to do with the indictment. The next item of anecdotal evidence is Lucy's diary. This is a particularly weak and ridiculous piece of evidence because there is nothing of any substance in this diary whatsoever. The police have tried to suggest that there was a code. I have completely annihilated this suggestion in a video on my channel, that there simply is no code. There aren't even any entries of any substance. There isn't even any writing of any meaning in this diary. It's not used as a personal diary. It's just something that Lucy uses to note down things from her life. So, for example, she notes down that there's a salsa class and that a washing machine is being delivered. To say that this is evidence of a serial killer is literally a joke. Also involved in the court case were various text messages. Even the police conceded that the overwhelming majority of text messages, over 99%, could not have gone in the court case because they were completely normal. The thing is that the messages that did appear in the court case were also completely normal. So this was another item of evidence that just had absolutely no value, merit whatsoever. And finally, I want to mention the eyewitness testimonies that occurred in court. Now, I strongly believe that the very harrowing information provided by parents should never have been part of the court case because it was only ever likely to make the court case less objective. Of course, the prosecution wanted to do this because the prosecution wanted to win, and this is a big problem with the adversarial system that we have in our courts in this country. In my view, it would be much better to have an inquisitorial system where we try to discover the truth. Nonetheless, there were eyewitness testimonies included in the court case, even though I strongly disagree with this. But the most important thing to note is that no one saw Lucy do anything wrong. Lucy Letby has never been seen doing anything wrong, doing anything malignant, engaged in any malfeasance, and this is agreed evidence by everyone and is undeniable. In this video, part 8, the court case. One of the most important items of evidence that was used in the court case was a shift chart which indicated that Lucy Letby was always on duty for all of the collapses in the case. This is categorically incorrect. It's now known that she wasn't on duty for many of the collapses, and also logistically there were often people around her when she was on duty. So the statistical case has been absolutely discredited and torn apart by numerous statisticians. The chart that was used in court should never have been used in court at all. I've already had 2 statisticians on this channel, Professor Richard Gill, Professor Jane Hutton, who've been strongly critical of the prosecution case, and there will be more coming in the future. Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam, who we mentioned earlier in this case, were the accusers of Lucy Letby, who selected cases that resulted in Lucy Letby going to court, then appeared in court to give evidence against Lucy Letby. I think anyone that is remotely objective would say that this was deeply unsatisfactory. Indeed, the evidence of Ravi Jairam was critical in the case of child K, which involved absolutely no meaningful evidence whatsoever. It was entirely based on the eyewitness testimony of Dr. Jairam. Unfortunately, emails surfaced which indicate that Dr. Jairam had given a misleading impression of what had occurred when he spoke in court, and now the experienced MP Sir David Davis has urged police to investigate Dr. Jairam for perjury in relation to child K. Another problem in the court case was the reversal of swipe card data that was used in relation to 9 of the infants in the case. The swipe card data was worthless anyway for numerous reasons. There were certain entrances and exits that didn't have swipe cards. There was an exit out of one nursery that didn't require nurses to swipe at all. Parents were moved in and out of nurseries without having to swipe because they didn't have swipe cards. And it was also conceded by the prosecution during the court case that anyone can sneak in behind anyone else at any time without swiping. So this data, which was a central part of the prosecution case, was absolutely worthless. There was all manner of surreal cross-examination during the court case, which is perhaps best exemplified by what I have sometimes described as Pyjama-gate and Shredder-gate, in which Lucy Letby was bizarrely questioned about wearing pyjamas and whether or not she owned a shredder. In the case of pyjamas, she actually was wearing nightwear, so this was an incredible debate on semantics, when it was very clear that Lucy Letby hadn't meant to deliberately mislead anyone, and it's a matter of no consequence anyway. But these were seriously held up as evidence that Lucy Letby lied in court, even though there are bigger question marks regarding expert evidence that was provided in support of the prosecution. There was also a bizarre paper towel trophy accusation, with the prosecution claiming that Lucy Letby waited around to collect a paper towel from a confidential waste bin. Frankly, the whole thing is just so preposterous, I don't want to go over it again. This was one of my most popular videos. Lucy Letby and the bizarre paper towel trophy accusation is utterly laughable. It's incredible that adults actually engaged in this discussion during a very important court case. Moving on now, there were accusations made during the court case that Lucy Letby changed Datex information on internal systems at the Council of Chester. This was all completely fabricated. There is no evidence that this ever occurred. And this is indicative of a pattern throughout the case in which the prosecution engaged in supposition, fabrication, invention, and complete nonsense. And when you have those four things commingled together, you get what is a chronically unsafe conviction, which is the conviction we're looking at with Lucy Letby. Finally, I'll just mention briefly that every single judge's decision in this case went against Lucy Letby. That began with a juror being excluded from the jury, but the judge allowed the trial to continue with less jurors than would usually be the case. The judge then allowed a majority verdict. We've already mentioned that he didn't have the guts, in my opinion, to throw Dr. Evans out of the court case when he clearly should have been thrown out of the court case. The judge allowed the prosecution to present its entire case rather than looking at individual infants and allowing the defence to respond to each individual infant. And there were many others. I'm not going to go over every single judge's decision, but literally everything that the judge decided went against Lucy Letby. Part 9, the panel. So we now have this incredible panel of, I believe it's now 28 experts across multiple specialisms with incredible backgrounds and credentials, some of the world's leading neonatal experts that are defending Lucy Letby and who see no evidence of malfeasance on this unit. For most people, for most objective people, that should be enough in itself, because the calibre of these people and the quantity as well, I should emphasise, far outweighs the prosecution experts that appeared in court. And as I've already mentioned, 95% of the prosecution case is Dr. Evans. So the panel that's been put together is so far in advance of what appeared in court, it's almost absurd. These are incredibly distinguished people, and when they presented their initial findings in February of this year, I know several people that were in the room for that, several journalists. Frankly, I wish I'd been there, and I kind of regret the fact that I didn't go. But I know that there was an extraordinary atmosphere, and very seasoned journalists said that it was the most extraordinary thing they'd ever seen in their life. As this court case that was one of the most important convictions that has ever occurred was torn apart by people, experts of the very highest calibre. And that is why so many people believe now that not only is Lucy Letby innocent, but that there were no crimes at this hospital, and what we had was a failing unit. Part 10, the real experts. And so the last thing that I want to mention briefly is that there are now legions of other experts who have come out to support the very clear notion that this is a miscarriage of justice. More people are coming out all the time. I've spoken with quite a few. You can see a few on the screen here. There are going to be many more. There are many others out there in the public domain. There are more still to come. There are more that I know about that I either haven't brought onto the channel or that haven't been brought into the public domain yet, but they're going to be coming as well. There are dozens and dozens and hundreds of nurses as well. There are literally hundreds of, possibly even thousands of healthcare professionals by now, but there are definitely hundreds of healthcare professionals that strongly believe that this is a miscarriage of justice and that Lucy Letby is innocent, whereas by contrast, there hasn't been a single credible or serious person who has come out to support the guilty verdict or to support the theories of Dr. Dewi Evans and the evidence that was presented in court. In this video, conclusion. In this video, we have examined the many reasons why the conviction of Lucy Letby is unsafe. This ultimately encompasses the following. Consultants on a neonatal unit who have, whether consciously or otherwise, I incidentally believe that it was not conscious, targeted a young nurse. A crumbling hospital and frankly NHS system which enabled poor outcomes for infants in the first place. A maniacal insistence that the spike in deaths at the Council of Chester is referred to the police instead of being investigated medically. A police investigation that rapidly treated a medical emergency as a crime and lurched from having no evidence of malfeasance to announcing to The Guardian that they would launch a criminal investigation within a matter of days, entirely on the basis of information provided by Lucy's accusers. The police, incomprehensibly, then involved the accusers in the investigation. An expert witness on which the case is almost entirely founded, who is woefully underqualified to begin with, who has proven himself to be wholly unreliable. A court case that was unfair, weighted enormously against the defendant, involving nonsense allegations, surreal cross-examination, and a large amount of supposition and fabrication. The shift chart, which was central to the entire prosecution case, has been fundamentally and totally discredited. This is very important because the prosecution repeatedly relied on inference from this chart. The circumstantial case used in court has no foundation. Perfectly normal behaviour for a nurse was weaponised against Lucy. The swipe card data is worthless and incorrect. Accusations were made without any supporting evidence, being entirely fabricated by the prosecution. In fact, the prosecution relied very strongly on emotional testimony from parents, which not only prejudiced the process and swayed the jury, but which also clearly had no evidential value because everyone agrees that no one saw Lucy do anything wrong. Medical evidence used in court has since been rejected and criticised by a legion of far more qualified experts. The conviction of Lucy Letby is now without foundation. Every serious person who has examined the case agrees with this statement. There isn't a single person with any credibility, qualifications, or relevant experience who has come forward to support the prosecution since the verdict was announced. Lucy Letby is innocent because all of the evidence points that way, and all credentialed experts who examine the case recognise this. The conviction of Lucy Letby is a national embarrassment which is emblematic of the failing institutions of this country. It will be spoken about and studied for centuries to come as an object lesson for numerous institutions of how not to operate. In conclusion, the highly regarded neonatal nurse Lucy Letby is innocent and must be exonerated.